The dog started growling before the veteran saw the blood frozen into the snow behind the carriage house. Mason hit the floor the second the window exploded inward. Glass skidded across the old wood planks, while Ghost lunged toward the dark hallway, barking so hard his injured shoulder gave out beneath him. Outside, snowmobiles circled the frozen lake with their headlights off. Then Mason heard boots crunching below the floorboards of the house his dead father never wanted sold. What do you think Ghost heard first? The welding torch hissed behind Mason Reed like an angry snake as he shut off the valve and peeled off his gloves. The garage smelled of burnt steel, old oil, and frozen mud dragged in by pickup tires. Outside the bay door, dawn was still trying to climb over the eastern ridge of the Rockies, turning the snowbanks pale blue. "See you tomorrow, Reed," his boss muttered, without looking up from the engine block. Mason nodded once. Tomorrow. People said that word easy, like it was guaranteed. His left knee tightened as he crossed the gravel lot toward his truck. The old injury always woke up in the cold. Helmand Province had left pieces of itself buried in his body that surgery never fully removed. Metal scar tissue, noise, especially noise. A steel pipe crashed somewhere behind the garage. Mason spun before he realized he was moving. Shoulders tense, eyes searching rooftops and windows before his brain caught up with the fact that he was standing in rural Colorado and not in a dust-choked Afghan village waiting for contact. A mechanic stared at him awkwardly. "You good, man?" Mason loosened his jaw. "Yeah." He climbed into the Silverado and drove north toward the ranch. The roads were slick with early snow. Pines stood dark against the mountains, and low clouds dragged across the peaks like smoke. Ghost sat in the passenger seat, rigid and alert, amber eyes tracking every passing vehicle. The Belgian Malinois had gone gray around the muzzle over the years, but nothing else about him looked old. Not the posture, not the eyes, not the way his ears twitched every time headlights appeared behind them. Mason scratched the dog behind the neck at a red light. Easy. Ghost never fully relaxed in moving vehicles anymore. Neither did Mason. By the time he reached the ranch, the sun had barely broken through the clouds. The property looked smaller than it used to. The barn leaned farther west than he remembered. One of the fence lines had collapsed beneath snowdrifts. A rusted tractor sat half-buried near the shed, like something abandoned after the world ended. But it was still home, or at least it had been once. Mason killed the engine. Ghost's ears lifted immediately. Something was wrong. The front porch light was on. 2 cardboard boxes sat beside the door. Mason stared at them through the windshield for several seconds without moving. Then he noticed the cot, folded neatly beside the boxes, his cot. The same army green folding bed he'd slept on for almost 3 years in Curtis's storage room after coming home from Afghanistan. Ghost let out a low sound deep in his throat, not barking, warning. Mason opened the truck door slowly. Cold wind swept across the yard, carrying the smell of snow and livestock. His boots crunched over frozen gravel as he walked toward the porch. The boxes weren't packed messy. They were organized, careful. That somehow made it worse. His shaving kit, boots, old paperbacks, medication bottles, a framed photograph face down beneath a wool jacket. Mason didn't touch anything. The front door opened before he knocked. Amber stood there holding a coffee mug in both hands. Her blonde hair was tied back tight. She looked exhausted, but not surprised to see him. Behind her, the house glowed warm and yellow. Mason stayed outside. Ghost stood beside his leg like a statue. Amber glanced once at the dog before speaking. "We didn't want to do this while the kids were awake." Mason said nothing. Curtis appeared behind her near the hallway. His younger brother looked older every year, thinner, eyes hollow from debt and long winters and too much whiskey. Curtis wouldn't look directly at him. That told Mason everything before anyone spoke. Amber exhaled hard. We sold the ranch. The words landed flat. No drama, no anger, just final. Mason looked past her shoulder into the kitchen. The same kitchen where their mother used to make elk chili every December. Same wooden table. Same crack in the ceiling above the sink. Different world. When? Mason asked quietly. Closing's in 3 weeks, Curtis muttered. Ghost shifted slightly. Mason noticed Curtis flinch at the movement. Amber tightened her grip on the mug. Mark Jensen's development company bought the land. They're turning this whole valley into vacation property. She swallowed. We can't carry everything anymore, Mason. Everything. Interesting word. Mason's eyes drifted toward the staircase inside the house. He could hear one of the kids coughing upstairs in their sleep. He suddenly realized they'd probably talked about this for weeks while he was gone working night shifts. Probably planned every detail. Probably waited until winter because they knew he had nowhere else to go. Curtis finally forced himself to look up. It's not like that. Mason looked at him. Curtis looked away first. That answered enough. Amber stepped outside and handed Mason a thick manila envelope. There's something else. He took it silently. It came from your father's attorney after probate cleared, she said. The old place in Black Hollow. Mason frowned slightly. My father didn't own anything. He did, apparently. Amber shrugged. A carriage house or something up in the mountains near Silverton. Curtis rubbed the back of his neck awkwardly. Dad kept paying taxes on it for years, never told anybody why. Amber gave a humorless laugh. Honestly, it's probably falling apart. But legally, it's yours now. Mason opened the envelope. Inside were old property papers, a deed and one black iron key, heavy cold. Older than anything else in his hand. Ghost immediately stepped closer. Amber kept talking. You can probably sell it for scrapland or something. If not, she hesitated. At least there's a roof. Mason stared at the key. Black Hollow. He remembered hearing that name as a kid. His father used to disappear there for days sometimes. Curtis shifted uncomfortably. You can stay until Friday, he said quietly. But after that, it's fine. The words came out flat, dead. Mason folded the papers back into the envelope. No yelling, no pleading. Afghanistan had burned most of that out of him years ago. He bent down toward the nearest box. His hand stopped over the framed photograph buried beneath clothes. It showed him and Curtis as teenagers standing beside their father near a lake. Walter Reed had one hand on Mason's shoulder. Ghost suddenly growled, low, sharp, combat alert. Mason froze instantly. The dog's eyes locked onto the road behind the ranch. A black SUV sat far down near the fence line, half hidden behind snowfall, watching. The vehicle rolled away. The second Mason noticed it. His pulse slowed the way it always did before danger. Not faster, slower, more focused. Ghost remained rigid beside him. Curtis looked confused. What's wrong with him? Nothing. Mason picked up the iron key between 2 fingers. For a second, he almost threw it into the box with the rest of his unwanted life. Ghost moved before he could. The dog snatched the key gently from Mason's hand and backed away 2 steps, ears forward, chest tight. Then came the growl, not fear, recognition. The exact sound Ghost used to make before patrols entered hostile villages overseas. Mason stared at the dog. Snow drifted sideways across the ranch. The porch light buzzed overhead. And somewhere deep in his chest, something cold began to wake up. Mason did not ask Curtis about the black SUV. He did not ask Amber if anyone had been calling about the old property. Questions made people lie faster, and Mason had spent enough years watching faces in bad country to know when silence could tell more than words. He took the key from Ghost's mouth. The dog released it without a fight, but his eyes stayed on the road. Mason loaded the boxes into the bed of the Silverado. The cot went in last. He tied everything down with 2 frayed bungee cords and an old cargo strap he had carried since Afghanistan. His hands moved automatically, checking tension, checking corners. making sure nothing would shift if the road turned bad. Curtis stood on the porch with both hands in his coat pockets. "You don't have to leave right now," he said. Mason looked at the boxes in the truck. "Looks like I do." Amber had already gone back inside. The kitchen curtains glowed gold behind her, and for a second Mason saw the shadow of one of the children moving past the window. He wondered what story they would hear in the morning. Uncle Mason moved out. Uncle Mason needed space. Uncle Mason was better off somewhere quiet. Nobody would say the porch had already been packed before he came home. Ghost jumped into the passenger seat before Mason opened the door all the way. He turned once, planted himself upright, and stared through the windshield. Mason climbed in and shut the door. The ranch sat in front of him for one last moment. The broken fence, the barn, the porch where his mother used to hang wet coats after snowstorms. Curtis stood under the buzzing light, small and stiff and unable to lift a hand. Mason put the truck in reverse. The tires crunched over frozen gravel. He did not look back. By the time they reached the county road, snow had thickened into a hard white curtain. The Silverado's headlights carved 2 weak tunnels through the dark. Ghost stayed rigid beside him, nose lifted toward the cracked window, reading the wind the way Mason used to read radio chatter. Mason slid the envelope from his coat and set it on the console. Black Hollow Road, Silverton County. The place was almost 4 hours away in good weather. In this storm, maybe 6. Maybe more if the passes iced over. He should have waited until morning. He knew that. But there are houses a man can sleep outside of, and there are houses that stop being houses the moment your things are boxed on the porch. At the first diner near Pagosa Springs, Mason pulled in for coffee. The neon sign flickered red against the snow. 3 pickup trucks sat near the entrance. A snowplow idled by the far pump, its yellow warning light sweeping across the windows in slow circles. The light hit Mason's eyes. For half a second, it was not a snowplow. It was a rotor wash kicking dust across a landing zone outside Lashkar. Someone yelling contact left. Someone else yelling for a medic. Sand hitting his teeth. Blood on latex gloves, the radio popping with broken voices. Ghost pressed his muzzle into Mason's ribs. Mason blinked. The diner came back. Coffee. Frying bacon. A waitress wiping down the counter. "You coming in or freezing out there?" she called through the glass. Mason took a breath, then another. "Yeah," he muttered. "Clear." Ghost watched him. "Don't look at me like that." Inside, Mason took the booth in the back corner. He sat facing the door. He did not think about doing it. His body chose before his mind did. Ghost lay beneath the table, front paws aligned, head up. The waitress poured coffee into a thick white mug. "Cold night to be traveling." Mason nodded. "Heading north? West. Roads over the pass are ugly, so I heard." She glanced down at Ghost. "Service dog? Partner?" That ended the questions. Mason ate half a plate of eggs and toast. He wrapped the other half in a napkin for Ghost, though the dog waited until Mason gave the soft click of his tongue before taking it. Outside, a truck rolled slowly past the diner, black, no plates visible through the snow. Ghost's ears snapped forward. Mason's hand stopped around the coffee mug. The truck did not park. It moved on, disappearing behind the curtain of white. The waitress came back with the check. "You all right, honey?" Mason looked down and realized his other hand had closed around the steak knife. He released it slowly. "Fine." He paid in cash and left before the coffee cooled. The mountains rose darker as the road climbed. Past midnight, the storm hardened. Snow came at the windshield sideways. The wipers fought and lost. The Silverado groaned up switchbacks, lined with pine trees heavy enough to snap. Mason kept both hands steady on the wheel. Ghost stood with his front paws braced against the dashboard, watching the road. Every few miles, Mason checked the mirrors. Nothing. Then headlights appeared 2 turns back. Far enough to be coincidence. Close enough not to be. Mason slowed. The lights slowed. He sped up a little on the straightaway. The lights did the same. "Yeah," Mason said softly. "I see it." Ghost's tail went still. At the next turnout, Mason cut his headlights and rolled in behind a wall of plowed snow. He shut off the engine before the truck fully stopped. The sudden silence landed heavy. Ghost did not move. Mason lowered his window an inch. Wind hissed through the crack. The trailing vehicle crawled around the curve 30 seconds later. Dark SUV, same shape as the one by the ranch. It passed the turnout without slowing, tires whispering over packed snow. Mason waited until its taillights vanished. Then he counted to 60, old habit. Never move on the first silence. Only on the second. He restarted the truck and pulled back onto the road. They drove another hour before he stopped again, this time at a closed ranger station with a covered awning. He backed the Silverado into the shadow beside the building, facing the exit. He left the engine off and layered his coat over his chest. Ghost settled across the passenger seat but did not sleep. Mason tried. The cold worked through the cab. His knee throbbed. Somewhere in the mountains, a branch cracked under snow weight. His eyes opened instantly. For a moment, he was back on a cot under canvas, listening for the wrong kind of silence. Ghost was already standing. Mason reached for the knife clipped near the emergency brake. Nothing moved outside. Only snow, only trees, only the long black shape of the road waiting ahead. Near dawn, they crossed into the San Juan Range. The storm finally weakened, leaving the world buried and blue. The sky opened just enough for a gray band of light to show behind the peaks. Mason followed the directions from the deed, down an unmarked road barely wide enough for the truck. Branches scraped both sides. The tires dipped into old ruts hidden beneath fresh snow. Then the trees broke. Black Hollow Lake appeared below, frozen at the edges, dark in the middle, where the water had not yet surrendered to winter. Pines ringed it like silent witnesses. Beyond the lake, pressed against the base of a rocky slope, stood the carriage house. Mason eased the truck to a stop. It was not a ruin, it was a fortress. 2 stories of dark stone and heavy timber, with a slate roof dusted white and tall arched doors facing the lake. One chimney rose from the far wall, crooked but still standing. Snow gathered along the sills, but the walls looked solid, almost stubborn, like the place had been waiting through every winter. Ghost began to whine, low, not afraid, not warning, recognition. Mason looked at the iron key lying cold in the console. Then he looked at the house. For the first time since leaving the ranch, he forgot to check the mirrors. Ghost did not. The Malinois stood with both front paws against the dashboard, ears pointed toward the carriage house, his breath fogging the glass in short bursts. His body had gone still in that old working dog way, every muscle waiting for permission. Mason sat there with one hand on the wheel and the other around the iron key. The building should have looked abandoned. It didn't. Snow had swallowed the old gravel drive, and the pines leaned close enough to scrape the roof. But the carriage house itself held its ground like something built by men who expected winter to lose. Dark stone walls rose from the slope. Heavy timber beams crossed beneath the roofline. The 2 tall carriage doors faced the lake, their iron hinges black with age but unbroken. A smaller door sat to the left, human-sized, waiting. Mason opened the truck door and stepped into the snow. The cold came up through his boots at once. It smelled like pine resin, frozen water, and old rock. Somewhere across the lake, ice groaned beneath its own weight, a deep sound that traveled through the valley like distant artillery. His shoulders tightened. Ghost hopped down beside him and pressed close to his leg. Mason's hand found the dog's collar before he knew he had reached for it. "Just ice," he said quietly. Ghost looked toward the lake, then back at him. Mason loaded one box under his arm and carried it toward the door. His knee complained on the incline. Halfway up the path, Ghost suddenly broke away and began circling the building. Ghost, The dog ignored the soft command, not disobedience, work. He moved along the front wall, nose low, pausing at the threshold, then the stone corner, then the wide carriage doors. He sniffed the seam beneath them and gave one sharp exhale before moving on. Mason watched him complete the first circuit. The dog knew this place. That was impossible. Ghost had never been here. At least Mason had never brought him here. The small door resisted the key at first. Mason jiggled it once, then stopped himself. He listened. Nothing inside, no movement, no scrape, no breath. He turned the key again, slower this time, feeling the pins give one by one. The old lock answered with a heavy click. The door opened inward. Cold darkness waited inside. Ghost pushed past Mason, then stopped 3 feet in, scanning left to right. Mason followed, letting his eyes adjust before stepping fully through. The air inside was dry and stale, thick with the smell of dust, cedar, and old machine oil. Light slipped through narrow windows along the upper wall, cutting pale lines across the floor. The ground level was larger than Mason expected. Cobblestones stretched beneath a high ceiling crossed by black beams. Old horse stalls lined one side, though their doors had been removed long ago. Against the far wall, shelves held rusted cans, rope, tarps, glass jars, and the kind of tools men kept because they believed tools always had one more use left in them. A covered shape sat near the center of the floor, big, almost the size of a truck. Mason set the box down and walked toward it. Dust moved under his boots. The canvas tarp was stiff with age, but not rotten. He lifted one corner. Underneath was an old army green Dodge Power Wagon. Paint dulled but intact, front grille squared off like a clenched jaw. Its tires were low but not flat. A tow chain hung across the front bumper. On the door, beneath dust and faded paint, Mason could just make out a white stencil. U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. His mouth went dry. Ghost gave a low whine from the back of the room. Mason dropped the tarp. The dog stood before a narrow door behind the last stall. Body angled, nose nearly touching the wood. His front paw lifted, tapped once, then again. Mason crossed slowly. The door was locked from this side with an old sliding bolt. He lifted it. Ghost immediately backed away. Mason opened the door to a small storage room. Shelves lined the walls, empty feed sacks, broken crates, a smell of cold earth. Nothing moved. But Ghost did not enter. He stared at the floorboards near the back wall. Mason crouched and brushed away dust with 2 fingers, scratches, not old claw marks, fresh enough to show pale wood beneath gray. He looked at Ghost. The dog's ears twitched. Mason stood. Not yet. He closed the storage room and slid the bolt back into place. Ghost stayed near it another moment, then turned toward the stairs. The staircase climbed along the west wall, wide and solid, its rails smooth from years of hands. Mason carried the iron key and his father's envelope as he went up. Each step gave a low wooden complaint, but none sagged beneath him. The second floor opened into one large room. It stopped him cold. A stone fireplace filled the north wall, wide enough to stand inside. Its hearth was blackened from old fires. 2 leather chairs sat before it beneath white sheets. A long wooden table stood near the center of the room. A small kitchen lined one side, with a cast-iron sink and cabinets made from dark pine. And beyond it all, facing the lake, was a tall arched window. Dust covered nearly everything. Nearly on the table sat a wooden box, clean, not wiped days ago, wiped recently. Mason did not move for several seconds. Ghost walked straight to the table and sat beside it. Mason heard his own breathing in the room. Slow, too loud, he approached the box. It was made of walnut, plain but well built, with brass corners and a latch worn smooth by use. On top, someone had carved a small symbol into the wood. A circle around 3 mountain peaks. Mason had seen it before, on his father's old belt buckle, on a coffee mug in the garage when he was a kid, on a faded patch Walter Reed kept in a drawer but never explained. Mason opened the latch. Inside lay a folded wool blanket, a stack of sealed envelopes, an old black and white photograph, and a leather dog collar with brass tags darkened by time. Ghost leaned forward. The dog sniffed the collar once. Then he sat back hard, almost like he had been struck. Mason picked it up. The brass tag read, Bishop. Below that, smaller letters, Canine Support Unit, Black Hollow Station. Mason turned the tag over. Walter Reed. His father's name was stamped on the back. The room seemed to tilt slightly. Mason lowered himself into one of the chairs, dust and all. The old leather groaned beneath him. He took the photograph next. It showed Walter Reed much younger, standing outside this same carriage house in a winter coat. Beside him was a Belgian Malinois, dark-faced and proud, wearing the collar Mason now held. But there was someone else in the picture. A boy of maybe 7 or 8, bundled in a red jacket, one mittened hand resting on the dog's head. Mason stared at the child, at the shape of the mouth, at the serious eyes. Him, a memory flickered. Snow, his father laughing, a dog running ahead through pines. His mother calling from somewhere behind them. Then it vanished. Mason looked at Ghost. The dog's amber eyes were fixed on him, quiet and steady. Mason set down the photograph and lifted the first envelope. His name was written across it in his father's blocky hand. Mason, no rank, no explanation. Just his name. He broke the seal carefully. Inside was one sheet of paper. The handwriting began without apology. If Ghost brought you here, it means you're finally ready. Mason stopped reading. The old house creaked softly around him. Downstairs, somewhere behind the locked storage room door, something shifted. A small sound. Wood against wood. Ghost rose at once, his lips pulled back from his teeth. And from outside the tall arched window, far below among the dark pines, a pair of headlights flickered once through the trees and went out. Mason didn't move toward the window right away. That was the first rule old Fear had taught him. Never rush to the glass. He lowered the letter to the table, reached for the oil lamp, and turned the flame down until the room went dim. The shadows pulled back over the beams and walls. Ghost stood beside him, body angled toward the window, but his eyes kept cutting to the stairwell. 2 possible directions, outside and downstairs. Mason listened. The house settled around them in small wooden sighs. Wind pushed snow against the stone walls. Somewhere below the sound came again, a faint scrape. Then nothing. Mason moved without thinking. He took 3 slow steps toward the arched window, staying off-center, keeping the wall between his body and the dark outside. He used the edge of the curtain to lift a corner. The pines were black. The lake was silver-gray under the clouds. No headlights now, no engine, no movement. But down near the old road, fresh tire tracks cut through the snow. Mason let the curtain fall. Ghost gave one sharp, quiet huff. I know. Mason picked up the letter again, but his hand did not leave the table. For a long moment, he stared at his father's handwriting. Walter Reed had never written much. Birthday cards had been signed Dad, nothing more. When Mason deployed the first time, Walter gave him a socket wrench set, a box of .308 rounds, and one sentence. Keep your head lower than your pride. Mason had laughed at him then. At 23, a man could mistake love for criticism if it came in a rough enough voice. Now Walter's words sat in front of him like a door. Mason read, If Ghost brought you here, it means you're finally ready. You may not remember this place. That's my fault. I brought you here when you were little, before your mother got sick, before the world turned sharp around the edges. You used to run along the lake with Bishop and come back soaked to the knees. Your mother would scold me for letting you near the water, then laugh because you looked too proud to apologize. Bishop was my dog before he was yours for those winters. Not legally, not the way the army keeps recruits. But he knew this land better than any man alive. Mason stopped and looked at Ghost. The Malinois had lowered himself beside the table, but his ears remained high. Bishop, Ghost. 2 dogs separated by decades, both somehow tied to the same stone house. Mason forced himself to keep reading. You were told I was a mechanic. That was true as far as it went. But before that, I worked logistics and structural engineering for the Army Corps. Cold War years. Mountain facilities, water systems, emergency routes no one wanted written on tourist maps. Black Hollow Station was one of them. This carriage house was never just a carriage house. The room seemed to grow colder around Mason. He looked toward the fireplace. The huge stone hearth filled the wall with patient silence. Walter's letter continued. After your mother died, I started noticing things in the lake. Dead trout near the north bank. Elk refusing to drink from the lower creek. Men from Black Hollow Mining driving at night with covered loads and no county permits. I asked questions. The wrong men heard them. Mason's jaw tightened. A memory surfaced without warning. His father standing in the garage years ago, arguing on the phone. Mason was 17, half drunk on anger and grief, pretending not to listen. No, you don't get to tell me what I saw. Then Walter had looked toward the doorway and stopped talking. Mason had remembered the silence more than the words. He read on. I kept records because records outlast frightened people, samples, maps, names, dates. If you are reading this, some of those men are still around, or their sons are. They'll smile first. Then they'll offer money. Then they'll threaten. That is the order men like that prefer. Mason glanced again toward the tire tracks outside. Walter had known, not guessed, known. Your brother won't understand. Curtis always wanted peace more than truth. I don't blame him for that. Peace looks like food on the table when you've spent a childhood watching your father chase shadows. But I was not chasing shadows. Mason swallowed once. The words pressed against something old in him. The last fight he ever had with his father came back in pieces. Rain on the garage roof. Walter blocking the doorway with one hand on his hip. Mason holding his enlistment papers. You're running because you don't know how to stay, Walter had said. And you're hiding because you don't know how to live. Mason had thrown back. Walter's face had gone still. Then Mason said the words that never stopped echoing. You're just a paranoid old man with a junkyard and a dead wife. He had left before his father answered. He had deployed 3 months later. Walter was dead before Mason came home. The letter blurred. Mason set it down and pressed 2 fingers against the bridge of his nose. Ghost rose quietly and placed his head on Mason's knee, not pushing, just there. The stovepipe ticked in the cold. Mason picked up the page again. There are things buried here I could not trust to Curtis. Not because he's bad, because he folds under pressure. You don't. You break, Mason, but you do not fold. There is a difference, and someday you'll need to know it. If you hate me after you finish the work. Behind the wood storage room downstairs, there is a sealed crawl space. Bishop found it first. If Ghost is anything like him, he'll find it too. Don't open it until morning, not in a storm, not alone. And if anyone comes asking about the lake, about water rights, or about North Ridge access, you tell them nothing. Nothing, Mason. Not even if they wear a badge. The final line was written darker than the rest, the pen pressed hard into the paper. Especially if they wear a badge. Mason sat back slowly. Outside, the wind moved through the pines with a sound like distant static. Downstairs, Ghost suddenly turned his head toward the storage room again. This time the sound was clearer. One knock, then another. Not random, not the house settling. 3 measured taps from beneath the floor. Mason stood. The old combat part of him returned cold and clean. He blew out the lamp. Darkness swallowed the room. His hand found the iron fire poker beside the hearth because it was the closest thing to a weapon. Ghost moved ahead of him to the stairs. Halfway down, a white beam swept briefly across the lower windows. A flashlight outside. Mason lowered his body, one hand on the rail, breath shallow through his nose. The beam passed once, twice. Then a man's voice drifted faintly through the storm. Place looks empty. Another voice answered from near the carriage doors. Check the back. Price wants to know if the dog found it. Mason's fingers tightened around the iron poker. Ghost's growl sank so low it seemed to come from the stone itself. And in the dark below them, beneath the locked storage room floor, something tapped 3 more times. Mason held on the stairs and did not breathe for 2 full seconds. The flashlight outside swept across the lower room again, cutting through the dusty windows in a thin white blade. It crawled over the power wagon, over the cobblestones, over the edge of Mason's cardboard box sitting exposed on the workbench. They had seen enough to know somebody was here. Mason eased 1 foot down another step. No creak. He shifted his weight to the outside edge of the board, the way he used to move through mud-walled compounds after midnight. Slow was smooth, smooth was quiet. Ghost stayed 1 step below him, shoulders low, eyes fixed toward the back wall. Another voice came from outside, closer now. Doors bolted. Then try a window. Mason's hand tightened round the iron poker. The old storage room waited in the dark to his left. The 3 taps had stopped, but the silence beneath the floor felt awake, listening. A metal tool scraped against the rear door. Ghost moved, not forward, sideways. He angled himself between Mason and the back of the building, ready to intercept anything that came through. Mason lowered 1 hand and touched 2 fingers to Ghost's shoulder. Hold. The dog froze. The rear latch rattled once, then harder. The bolt held. A man cursed softly outside. Mason's eyes adjusted enough to see the layout. Main door 30 feet ahead. Workbench to the right. Old stalls to the left. A rack of tools near the power wagon. He needed more than a fire poker. He crossed the floor, low and quiet, reached the workbench, and felt along the wall until his hand closed over cold steel. A shotgun. Old, pump-action, Walters. Mason turned it carefully in his hands. Empty weight felt wrong. He checked the chamber by touch. Nothing. Then his fingers found a small canvas shell pouch hanging on the same hook. He loaded by feel, each shell sliding home with a soft, deadly click that sounded far too loud in the dark. Outside glass cracked. Not shattered, just tested. Mason looked toward the storage room. Ghost looked too. The floor beneath it gave 1 faint knock, then silence again. Whoever, or whatever, had made that sound was not the men outside. The first man came through a side window near the horse stalls. He forced it up just enough to slide an arm in, then a shoulder. Mason waited until the man was halfway through. Then he pumped the shotgun. The sound filled the carriage house like a door slamming shut on the whole mountain. The man froze. Mason spoke from the dark. Back out. No yelling, no threat. Just instruction. The man did not move. I said back out. Outside, the second man whispered, go. The one in the window dropped hard into the snow, scrambling backward. Ghost's growl rolled through the room. The flashlight beam vanished. Boots crunched fast across the rear yard. A truck door opened somewhere beyond the trees. Engine turning over, tires spinning once before catching. Mason stayed still until the sound faded down the access road. Only then did he move to the window. No silhouette, no taillights, no voices. He did not go outside, not yet. He locked the shotgun under 1 arm and went to the back door. The bolt was scratched, fresh. Silver marks cut through old black iron. Near the bottom, wet snow had blown under the seam and begun melting across the stone floor. Ghost nosed the crack, then sneezed once. Diesel, tobacco, cheap leather. The dog would remember. Mason lit the oil lamp again low. The flame showed his hands steady, but the skin across his knuckles had gone white. He dragged a wooden crate in front of the broken side window and jammed an old stall board across it. Temporary. Ugly, enough for the night. Then he turned to the storage room. The sliding bolt felt colder than before. Ghost stood pressed against his leg. Mason lifted the bolt and opened the door. The small room smelled of earth and old burlap. Nothing looked different at first. Shelves, feed sacks, cracked crates, the back wall. Then Ghost went to the floorboards and pawed once at the fresh scratches he had found earlier. Mason crouched. The scratches formed a half circle around one board. Not claw marks, a pull point. He wedged the iron poker into the seam and pried. The board resisted, then lifted with a long wooden groan. Under it was darkness, not a deep hole, a narrow crawl space. Cold air moved up from below. Mason lowered the lamp. A small metal box sat just beneath the opening, wrapped in oilcloth. Beside it was a length of pipe tied to a string that ran deeper into the crawl space. The tapping. Something had been rigged to knock from underneath when the building shifted, or when pressure hit the floor above. Walter had built an alarm. Mason almost laughed, but no sound came. He lifted the box out. Inside were three things: a folded map, a key marked North Ridge, and a photograph of Walter standing with another man beside Black Hollow Lake. The other man wore a sheriff's uniform, younger then, smiling broadly, with one hand resting on Walter's shoulder. On the back, written in Walter's hand, were 4 words: "Don't trust Doyle." Mason stared at the name. The next morning confirmed the warning. Sheriff Tom Doyle arrived just after sunrise in a white county SUV, tires crunching over the drive like he owned the snow. He was in his late 50s, broad through the middle, face wind-burned, smile easy enough to look practiced. Ghost watched him from the open doorway without blinking. Doyle tipped his hat. "Morning. You must be Mason Reed." Mason stood with the shotgun unloaded but within reach behind the door. "That's right. Got a call about activity up here last night." "From who?" Doyle's smile did not move. "Folks hear things." Mason looked at the untouched snow around the property. No neighbors. No houses, no road traffic for miles. Folks must have good ears. Doyle gave a small chuckle and looked past him into the carriage house. "Mind if I take a look?" "Yes," the smile thinned. Mason did not fill the silence. Doyle shifted his eyes to Ghost. "Dog always that unfriendly. He's selective." The sheriff nodded slowly, then handed Mason a business card. "If you run into trouble, call me before you do anything foolish. Mountains make men think they're alone." Mason took the card by the edge. Doyle turned back toward his SUV, then paused. "One more thing. Nolan Price from Black Hollow Mining may come by. His company owns parcels near the lake. Good man. Big plans for this valley." Ghost gave a single sharp bark. Doyle looked at the dog. Mason looked at Doyle. The sheriff got into his SUV and drove away without another word. Only after the engine faded did Mason walk to the tree line. Ghost led him there. 30 yards from the carriage house, fixed high against the trunk of a pine, was a small black camera no bigger than a deck of cards. Infrared lens, fresh battery pack, pointed straight at the upper window where Mason had found his father's letter. He reached up and pulled it loose. On the back, stamped in white, were the initials BHM, Black Hollow Mining. Mason closed his fist around the camera until the plastic cracked. Ghost stood beside him, staring into the trees. Far across the frozen lake, something metallic flashed once in the morning light. A scope, or binoculars. Then it disappeared. Mason did not chase the flash. A younger man might have. A younger Mason would have grabbed the shotgun, cut across the lake, and tried to prove he was still fast enough to meet danger head-on. That younger man had gotten people hurt in Afghanistan. He knew better now. He dropped to one knee beside Ghost and pointed 2 fingers toward the carriage house. Back. Ghost hesitated only half a second. His eyes stayed on the far side of the lake, but he turned and moved with Mason, keeping low through the snow as if the old training still lived in his bones. Inside, Mason shut the door and slid the bolt into place. Then he went through the building the way he had gone through abandoned compounds overseas. Corners first, dark spaces next, windows last. He did not call it fear. He called it clearing the AO. Because names mattered when the nerves started shaking. The main floor was quiet. The storage room was quiet. The upstairs loft held only dust, cold light, and the old fireplace waiting against the north wall. Mason carried the cracked camera up with him and set it on the table beside Walter's letters. The black plastic casing had split under his grip. A small memory card slid halfway out of the side. He stared at it. Someone had watched him find the box, maybe watched Ghost find the storage room, maybe watched his face when he read the first letter. Ghost gave a soft scratch against stone. Mason looked over. The dog stood by the fireplace, nose pressed to the lower right corner of the hearth. His ears were forward, tail straight, front paw lifting and falling against one particular stone. Tap, 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 the same rhythm from beneath the floor. Mason crossed the room slowly. Ghost. The dog did not stop. He scraped again, claws clicking across mortar. Then he looked back at Mason, with the hard, urgent stare he used when a scent trail turned fresh. Mason crouched beside him. The stone Ghost had chosen sat low near the floor, darker than the others. At first glance it looked ordinary. Rough-cut granite, smoke-stained around the edges. But the mortar around it was different. Cleaner, thinner, reworked by a careful hand. Mason ran one finger along the seam. A draft touched his knuckle. Cold air from inside the wall. He went downstairs and came back with a flat pry bar from the workbench. Ghost stayed beside the hearth the whole time, guarding the stone like it might run. Mason wedged the pry bar into the seam and leaned his weight into it. Nothing. He adjusted the angle. The metal flexed. Old mortar cracked with a dry whisper. Ghost backed up one step. Mason pushed again. The stone shifted. Not much, just enough. He set his shoulder, exhaled slow, and forced it outward. The block slid free with a grinding sound and landed heavy on the floorboards. Behind it was black space. Mason held up the oil lamp. A narrow cavity dropped behind the hearth, lined with poured concrete. A rusted metal ladder descended into darkness. Not a chimney, not a crawl space, a room. His father had built a room under the fireplace. For a long moment, Mason simply stared. The smell rising from below was dry and mineral, like sealed basements and old paper. Not rot, not mold. Whoever made this had known what they were doing. Ghost pushed his head into the opening and whined. Not you first. Mason tied a rope from the table leg to his belt, checked the knot twice, then took the lamp in one hand and climbed down. The ladder held. At the bottom, his boots touched concrete. The chamber was barely tall enough for him to stand straight. It ran beneath the fireplace wall, maybe 10 feet long and 6 feet wide. Shelves lined one side. Metal ammo cans sat stacked on the floor. A military field radio rested on a crate, its handset wrapped in cloth. Beside it were maps sealed in plastic tubes. Mason lifted one tube and opened it. Black Hollow Lake, North Ridge access, underground water lines, old mining tunnels marked in red pencil. He unrolled another, same lake, different markings, water sample points, dates, names. Then he saw the filing box. It sat beneath a tarp near the back wall, stenciled with faded letters. W. Reed Water Records. Mason pulled it into the lamplight. Inside were folders, dozens of them. Photographs, lab reports, handwritten notes, copies of permits, letters never mailed. Every page careful, every date circled, every signature copied twice. Walter had not been chasing shadows. He had been building a case. Mason opened a folder marked Lower Creek, Fish Kill. Photographs slid out across his knees. Trout belly up in shallow water. Elk tracks turning away from the bank. A boy holding a dead dog in front of a farmhouse, his face blurred by water damage. Mason closed the folder slowly. On the lowest shelf behind 2 ammo cans sat a black plastic case. It was newer than the rest. He opened it. Inside was a VHS tape wrapped in a note. If you've reached this room, they already know. Mason's throat tightened. There was more beneath the tape. A sealed envelope, a list of names, and one photograph of Nolan Price, standing beside a younger Sheriff Doyle near a mining truck, both men smiling under a Black Hollow mining banner. Mason heard Ghost whine above him, then a scrape near the upper room. Mason killed the lamp with 2 fingers. Darkness swallowed the chamber. He stood still, one hand on the ladder, listening. Nothing moved upstairs. Then came Ghost's low warning growl. Not from fear, from contact. Mason climbed fast and quiet, emerging through the fireplace cavity into the loft. Ghost stood facing the arched window, teeth showing, shoulders squared. Outside, snow drifted across the lake, no person in sight. But pinned to the inside of the window frame was something that had not been there before. A folded piece of paper. Mason crossed to it, keeping himself to the wall. He pulled it free and opened it. 3 words had been written in red marker. "Stop digging, Reed." Ghost lunged toward the glass, barking once hard enough to shake dust from the beams. Mason looked past the window to the dark line of trees, then back at the folders spread beside the fireplace, at the maps, at the tape, at the note from his dead father. His hand closed around the VHS case, and for the first time since Hellmand, the mission was clear. The feeling hit Mason hard enough to make him stand still. Not hope, not anger, purpose. Clean and sharp. The kind that used to arrive over the radio at 2 in the morning when somebody whispered coordinates, and every man in the convoy suddenly knew exactly who he needed to become. Ghost stopped barking first. The dog backed away from the window, ears still forward, then returned to the fireplace and sat beside the hidden opening beneath the stone hearth, guarding it. Mason looked down at the tape in his hands. Whatever Walter had recorded mattered enough for men to drive through a snowstorm and threaten a dead man's son. That narrowed the possibilities. Truth usually did. He carried the VHS tape downstairs into the workshop. Dust floated through the pale afternoon light. The old power wagon sat beneath its tarp like a sleeping tank. Against the far wall, buried beneath crates and coiled chains, Mason found what he was looking for. A television, old tube model. Beside it sat a VCR covered by a canvas cloth. Walter had prepared everything. Ghost circled once near the front doors, then settled facing outward while Mason cleared a space on the workbench. He plugged the television into an extension cord running from a rattling generator outside the building. The screen crackled alive with gray static. Mason slid the tape halfway into the machine, then stopped. Something outside had changed. Ghost stood instantly, his entire body tightened. Mason killed the TV sound and listened. Nothing at first, then crunch, snow, close. Not the soft drift of falling snow, weight boots. Mason moved to the nearest window and used the edge of a hanging tarp to look outside. 3 figures, dark coats, moving through the trees along the lakeside, not trying to hide anymore. Ghost let out one deep warning bark. The figure stopped. One beam of light snapped toward the carriage house, another toward the truck. Mason cursed under his breath. Too early. He grabbed the shotgun from beside the stairs and checked the shells again by touch. Full enough. Outside, a voice echoed faintly through the wind. "Mason Reed." No answer, "Mr. Price just wants to talk." Ghost's lips peeled back slowly. Mason recognized the tone immediately. Not a negotiation, positioning. While one man talks, another moves. His eyes scanned automatically. One near the lake, one at the tree line, third one missing. There. Moving low along the east wall toward the side entrance. Mason's pulse slowed. Combat breathing returned without permission. In through the nose, out through the mouth. He pointed 2 fingers toward Ghost. Track. The Malinois vanished into shadow without a sound. Mason killed the workshop lights. Darkness swallowed the lower floor. Outside, the talking stopped. A second later, the side window exploded inward. Glass sprayed across the cobblestones. Mason ducked behind the power wagon as a flashlight beam whipped through the darkness. Clear left, military language, or men pretending to know it. Ghost hit first. A blur from the dark. The intruder screamed as 80 pounds of Belgian Malinois slammed into him near the broken window. Mason heard the man hit the floor hard. Then came the gunshot. The blast inside the stone carriage house sounded like artillery. Ghost yelped, not loud, worse, short, sharp. Mason moved before thought caught up. He came around the truck with the shotgun leveled. Drop it. The man on the floor scrambled backward, clutching his arm where Ghost had torn through the jacket. Another figure appeared, outside the window, weapon raised. Mason fired once into the ceiling beam above him. Wood exploded downward. Next one's lower. That stopped them. Silence crashed into the room except for Ghost's breathing. Mason's eyes found the dog near the stalls. Blood darkened the fur along Ghost's shoulder. The Malinois tried to stand fully and nearly collapsed. Something inside Mason snapped tight. The intruders saw it happen too. Men understood certain looks instinctively. The kind that meant someone had just crossed a line they should not have crossed. "Move," one shouted outside. The figures disappeared back into the trees. Engine noise roared seconds later. Tires spun on snow, gone. Mason dropped beside Ghost immediately. The dog's breathing came fast but controlled. Blood pulsed between Mason's fingers when he pressed against the wound. "Easy, buddy. Easy." Ghost tried to lick his wrist. Mason's hands shifted automatically into medic mode. Not panic, procedure. He ripped open one of the old military aid kits. Walter kept hanging near the workbench. Gauze, tape, tourniquet, not enough. The bullet had passed through the upper shoulder. Close, but not catastrophic. Lucky by inches. Mason packed the wound hard. Ghost jerked once but never snapped at him. "Stay with me." Outside, snow hammered against the walls harder now. Wind screamed down from the ridge. The storm had returned full force. No cell signal, no nearby vet. No ambulance coming up Black Hollow Road tonight. Mason heated the tip of his hunting knife over a propane burner until the metal glowed dull red. He hated doing field work on living things. Always had. Ghost watched him without fear. That somehow made it worse. Mason cleaned the wound the best he could. Burned closed what he had to. Wrapped the shoulder tight. The dog finally lowered his head against Mason's thigh. The workshop smelled of blood, smoke, and old oil. Hours passed that way. Mason sitting against the power wagon tire, Ghost breathing beside him. Wind battering the carriage house like waves hitting rock. At some point after midnight, exhaustion dragged Mason halfway into sleep. Then the television flickered on by itself. Static hissed across the dark room. Mason's eyes snapped open instantly, heart already racing before his brain understood why. For half a second he saw another screen. Drone footage, thermal signatures. A convoy burning in white heat across a desert road. Then Ghost nudged his hand. The workshop returned. The TV glowed blue-gray. The VCR tray had slid open on its own from a power surge. The tape sat halfway out. Mason stared at it. Walter's last recording. The reason Ghost had nearly died. He reached for the cassette slowly. Ghost lifted his head despite the pain and pressed his muzzle weakly against Mason's sleeve. Then, with trembling effort, the dog pulled once toward the television. Toward the tape. Mason looked at him. "You serious?" Ghost's ears twitched once. Mason let out a breath through his nose that almost became a laugh. "Yeah," he whispered. "Okay." He loaded the tape into the machine. The screen crackled, static rolled. Then an image slowly appeared, and Mason saw his father alive for the first time in 8 years. The footage shook slightly before stabilizing. Walter Reed sat at a wooden table. Mason recognized immediately. The upstairs loft. The same fireplace behind him. The same arched window looking over Black Hollow Lake. Only the room had been alive then. Firelight moved across the stone walls. Snow drifted outside the glass. A dog lay near the hearth. Bishop. Walter looked older than Mason remembered. Thinner too, gray heavy in his beard. But his eyes were sharp, tired, watching things even while sitting still. He leaned forward and adjusted the camera. "If this tape is playing," he said, "either I finally got smart enough to leave proof behind, or somebody forced your hand." He rubbed one hand over his mouth. "For the record, my name is Walter Reed, former civilian contractor attached to Army Corps infrastructure operations. And what Black Hollow Mining is doing under this valley is poisoning the water table." The television crackled softly. Mason sat motionless beside Ghost, one hand resting against the dog's bandaged shoulder. Walter reached off-screen and held up a map. The contamination started 12 years ago when they reopened Shaft 9 near the North Ridge. Official reports say the mine was sealed after runoff concerns. That's a lie. The footage cut abruptly. Night vision replaced the firelit room. A shaky handheld recording showed trucks crawling through the mountains after midnight without headlights. Men in reflective jackets unloaded black barrels beside the frozen shoreline. Then came another cut. Water, dark liquid pumping through wide industrial hoses into the lake beneath the ice. Walter's breathing came louder behind the camera. "They dump during storms," he whispered. "Less chance of being seen. Less chance of residue staying near the banks." The image zoomed closer. One of the workers turned toward the camera. Nolan Price, younger, smiling while giving instructions. Mason felt Ghost shift uneasily beside him. Walter's voice returned. "I took samples for 11 months. Mercury, solvents, arsenic. Enough contamination to poison every ranch downstream." Another cut, this one from farther away. A bulldozer pushing dirt over rows of buried barrels. Walter whispered coordinates under his breath while filming. Then the tape jumped again. A date appeared in the corner of the screen. 3 weeks before Walter died. The image showed the old Marina Road near Black Hollow Lake. Snow falling sideways through floodlights. Men arguing beside a pickup truck. One voice rose above the wind, Walter's. "You said containment systems were installed." Another man stepped into frame, Sheriff Doyle. No uniform, heavy winter coat, one hand gripping Walter's jacket. "You need to let this go." Walter shoved him away. "You let kids drink this water." Doyle looked exhausted more than angry. "You think Price built this alone? Half this valley lives off that mine." Walter pointed toward the lake. "Then half this valley's dying and doesn't know it yet." The tape crackled hard. For several seconds, only static rolled across the screen. Then came the final segment. Walter sat close to the camera now, face bruised near the jaw. Blood crusted along one eyebrow. Bishop paced behind him. "If anything happens to me," Walter said quietly, "it wasn't an accident." His eyes lifted briefly toward something off-screen. "They offered money first. Then they threatened Curtis. Then they threatened Mason after Afghanistan." Mason's stomach tightened. Walter exhaled slowly. "If you're watching this, son, I'm sorry I couldn't keep all of it away from you." The old man's voice nearly broke there. "Not from fear, from exhaustion. You were right about one thing. I did hide too much. Thought I could outlast them alone. Thought if I carried it myself, nobody else would get hurt." Bishop suddenly barked in the footage. Sharp, warning. Walter turned his head toward the downstairs level of the carriage house. Then back to the camera. "There's one more thing. The property itself." The tape snapped into static. Mason lunged forward instinctively, smacking the side of the VCR. The image flickered back only long enough to show Walter looking directly into the lens. Then the screen dyed black. The generator outside coughed once. Everything went dark. Silence swallowed the carriage house. Ghost was on his feet immediately despite the injury. Growling, low, close. Mason grabbed the shotgun by instinct and moved toward the nearest window. No lights outside now, no engine noise, nothing but snow. Then came the sound, a click. Metal against metal, the front breaker box. Someone was outside. Mason killed his flashlight before it could fully come on. Darkness covered him again. He listened hard enough to hear his own pulse. Boots circled slowly around the building. Crunch. Pause. Crunch. Ghost tracked the movement with his head. The footsteps stopped beneath the upstairs window. Then a man's voice rose softly through the storm. You should have taken the money, Reed. Nolan Price. Mason recognized it instantly from the tape. Calm, educated, the kind of voice men trusted before they realized trust was expensive. You don't know what your father got into, Nolan called. Mason's stayed silent. You think this town survives without Black Hollow. You think those ranches, those diners, those schools stay open on mountain air? Ghost's growl deepened. Outside, Nolan sighed. Your father was stubborn too. A flashlight beam suddenly swept upward across the arched window. Ghost barked once. Gunfire cracked from outside. The shot punched through the upper glass. Mason dropped instantly, dragging Ghost down beside the wall as shattered glass exploded across the floorboards. Another round slammed into the fireplace stones. Stone chips sprayed Mason's face. Outside, engines roared alive, more than one vehicle. Mason crawled low toward the side wall, shotgun ready, heart hammering in controlled bursts. Combat breathing, count exits, identify angles, move before they flank. Ghost limped beside him, bleeding through the bandage again, but still alert. The truck engines faded suddenly, retreating, not attacking, sending a message. Mason waited another full minute before standing. Snow blew through the shattered upper window in pale, swirling ribbons. The television remained black. Walter's final sentence unfinished forever. The property itself, Mason stared at the dead screen, then at the broken window, then at Ghost. The dog looked back at him through pain and exhaustion, tail thumping once against the floorboards. Mason reached down and rested his forehead briefly against Ghost's. They killed him, he whispered. Outside, somewhere deep in the valley below Black Hollow Lake, a siren echoed once through the snow, and then abruptly cut off. Mason stood in the broken glow of the upstairs loft, listening to the silence that followed. Not natural silence. The kind that comes after men decide something. Snow drifted through the shattered window and melted against the old floorboards. Ghost leaned weakly against Mason's leg, blood soaking slowly through the fresh bandage again. They could not stay here. Not tonight. Nolan had stopped talking. That was worse. Mason crossed to the table and swept Walter's files into an old canvas rucksack, VHS tape, water maps, Sheriff Doyle's photograph, the memory card from the hidden camera. He packed fast but careful. The way men pack when they already know they'll have to run carrying everything they own. Ghost watched him without complaint. Only when Mason grabbed his coat did the dog struggle to stand fully. Easy. Ghost planted all four paws anyway. Good dog, too loyal for his own body. Mason checked the shotgun, stuffed extra shells into his pocket, then killed the generator outside. Darkness swallowed the carriage house completely. No lights, no silhouette, no target. He opened the hidden room beneath the fireplace one last time and slid the remaining folders deeper inside. Stone back in place. Mortar dust brushed away with his sleeve. If they torched the house, some truth might still survive underground. The storm had thickened by the time they stepped outside. Snow whipped across the lake sideways under a sky black enough to erase the mountains. Mason paused near the truck. The Silverado would be obvious, easy to track, too loud. Instead, he cut west through the trees on foot with Ghost beside him. The old military instinct returned in layers. Avoid ridgelines, move below silhouette, use creek beds when possible. Break trail through rock patches where snow won't hold prints. Ghost limped badly now, but every few yards he stopped to listen before moving again. Mason adjusted pace automatically to match him. Half a mile from the carriage house, headlights swept through the treesy behind them. Searching, too organized to be random locals. Mason pulled Ghost down beside a fallen pine and covered the dog's dark coat with snow-crusted branches. They stayed still while two snowmobiles crawled across the frozen shoreline below. Men shouted over the wind. Tracks head west. They can't get far with the dog hit. Ghost's ears flattened. Mason rested one hand against the dog's neck until the engines moved farther away. Only then did they continue. The creek Walter marked on the map cut through a narrow ravine north of the lake. The water still moved beneath a crust of ice, black and fast. Mason followed it because moving water erased scent and footprints both. By dawn his knee had stiffened so badly he could barely bend it. Ghost stumbled twice. The second time the dog stayed down longer than Mason liked. Mason crouched beside him in the snow. "Come on, buddy." Ghost lifted his head slowly. There was no panic in the dog's eyes, only trust. That hurt worse somehow. Mason pulled half a protein bar from his pocket and fed it to him piece by piece. Ghost chewed obediently, then pushed himself upright again. The hunting blind appeared through the storm just after sunrise. Old wood, collapsed roof on one side, hidden deep among aspens overlooking a frozen meadow. Walter's map had marked it with one small X emergency shelter. Mason got Ghost inside and blocked the entrance with dead brush. The place smelled of old cedar, rodent nests, and damp wool left behind years ago. A rusted propane heater sat in one corner beside stacked firewood wrapped beneath tarps. Walter again, always preparing. Mason managed to get the heater running after 3 tries. Weak warmth spread slowly through the tiny blind. Ghost collapsed near the heat immediately. Mason removed the bandage carefully. The wound looked angry now, red around the edges, still bleeding in small pulses when Ghost shifted. Not good, he needed help, real help. By afternoon, the storm finally loosened enough for Mason to risk moving again. Walter's map showed one cabin farther north beyond the old logging ridge. Mercer Veterinary Services. Mason almost laughed when he read it. A veterinarian, hidden in the middle of nowhere, sounded exactly like the kind of thing his father would trust. The cabin sat alone above a narrow valley, smoke curling from the chimney. Solar panels lined one side beneath snowdrifts. A battered Jeep Wrangler rested near the porch, with Marine Corps stickers faded across the bumper. Ghost nearly collapsed, climbing the last slope. Mason caught him before he hit the ice. The front door opened before he could knock. A woman stepped out holding a shotgun. Late 30s maybe. Dark braid, heavy flannel coat. Eyes that scanned Mason once and dismissed him entirely in favor of the dog. What happened? Gunshot inside now. No hesitation, no fear, Marine. Mason recognized it instantly. She cleared the table in one sweep while Mason lifted Ghost onto it. The dog whined once but stayed still. The woman examined the wound fast and efficiently. Bullet passed through clean. "Lucky. Can you help him?" She looked up sharply. "I already am." Mason shut up after that. Hours blurred beneath lamplight and the smell of antiseptic. The woman stitched the shoulder while Ghost drifted in and out under sedation. Snow tapped against the windows. A radio murmured weather reports somewhere in the background. Only after Ghost stabilized did she finally look at Mason properly. "You Army?" "Yeah." "Afghanistan?" Mason nodded. She leaned back against the counter. "Marine Corps. Helmand and Kandahar." That explained the eyes. Not hard, just tired in familiar places. "Name's Ellie Mercer," she said. "Mason Reed." At the mention of Reed, something flickered across her face. Small, gone quickly. "You're Walter's son." Mason stiffened slightly. "You knew him." Ellie tied off the last stitch carefully before answering. "He came here 3 months before he died." The heater hummed softly in the corner. Mason looked at Ghost sleeping under the blanket, then back at her. What did he want? Ellie's expression darkened. He wanted antibiotics for Bishop at first. She paused. Then he asked if I knew how to disappear someone in these mountains. Outside, wind moved low through the trees. Mason felt the old cold sensation return to his chest, not fear. The feeling that the battlefield had just gotten bigger. Ellie washed blood from her hands slowly. Before Mason could ask another question, headlights appeared through the storm below the ridge. More than one vehicle. Ellie turned toward the window instantly. That road dead ends here, she said quietly. Ghost opened his eyes. And somewhere outside in the snow, an engine door slammed shut. Ellie moved first, not fast. Efficient. She killed the lamp over the examination table. And the cabin dropped into shadow except for the orange glow from the wood stove. Mason automatically stepped away from the windows. Ghost tried to rise from the blanket near the heater. "Stay," Mason whispered. The dog ignored him halfway, struggling onto 3 legs anyway. Outside, boots crunched through snow toward the porch. Ellie glanced toward a rifle mounted above the doorway. "You armed?" Mason lifted the shotgun slightly. "That answer your question?" A humorless smile touched her mouth for half a second. Then came the knock. 3 calm raps, not aggressive, worse, professional. Ellie did not open the door. "Clinic's closed," she called. A man answered through the storm. "Sheriff's department." Mason and Ellie exchanged a look. Ghost growled softly. The voice continued. "We're looking for Mason Reed. Reports of a dangerous armed man connected to vandalism near Black Hollow property." Mason almost laughed at that. Ellie didn't. She stepped quietly toward the back hallway and motioned for Mason to follow. The cabin extended farther than it looked from outside. Storage room, feed room, a mudroom leading to another exit hidden behind stacked firewood. Marine planning. Mason respected it immediately. Outside, the knock came again, harder. "Ms. Mercer," the deputy called. "Open the door." Ellie leaned close to Mason. "Back trail runs north to the logging ridge. Stay off the main road. You helping me gets complicated for you." Her eyes hardened. "Walter saved my brother after Fallujah. This started complicated." Ghost limped toward Mason before Ellie stopped him gently. "He moves like that, he'll bleed through the stitches." Ghost showed teeth immediately. "Easy," Mason murmured. The dog calmed at once. Ellie disappeared briefly into another room and returned carrying a folded paper map and a ring of keys. "There's an old ranger station near Copper Pass," she said. "Nobody uses it anymore except snowcat crews during avalanche season. You can lay low there." Mason took the map. "You trust me awful quick." "No." Ellie glanced toward the front door where someone had started rattling the knob. "I trust Ghost." Another heavy knock shook the cabin. "Last warning," Mason crouched beside the dog. "You up for this?" Ghost pressed his head once against Mason's chest, then stood. "Good enough." They slipped through the rear exit moments before the front door burst open. Cold air slammed into them. Mason pulled Ghost into the tree line just as flashlight beams exploded across the cabin behind them. Voices shouted. Ellie's voice rose sharp and furious inside, drowning out the deputies for a few seconds. "Good woman." Mason moved north through dense pine while Ghost tracked beside him. Snow reached nearly to Mason's knees now. Every step burned through his injured leg. But his mind stayed focused. Distance, cover, angles. The map Ellie gave him bounced against his chest beneath the jacket. Walter's files rode in the pack on his back. And somewhere inside all of it sat the unfinished sentence from the tape. The property itself. By dawn, they reached Copper Pass Ranger Station. The place looked abandoned. One-story concrete structure, half buried beneath snowdrifts. Radio tower bent sideways from some old storm. Windows boarded. Perfect. Mason got the side door open with one shoulder. Inside smelled of dust, mouse droppings, and cold metal, but the roof held. There was a propane stove, cots, old emergency supplies. Ghost collapsed immediately beside the heater once Mason got it running. Mason sank into a chair opposite him and finally allowed exhaustion to catch up. For 20 minutes, he stared at the stove flames without moving. Then he heard Walter's voice again in his head. The property itself. Mason sat forward suddenly. Property. Not the lake, not the evidence. The land itself mattered. He pulled out the folders again and spread them across the old ranger desk. Maps, water surveys, legal copies, mining permits. Hours passed while snow buried the station outside. Then Mason found it. A folded legal document hidden between water contamination reports. Black Hollow Easement Agreement, 1948. He read it once. Then again, slower. His pulse began to climb. The Carriage House property wasn't just private land. It controlled the original water access route feeding Black Hollow Lake, and beneath that were mineral transport easements crossing the North Ridge. Without those rights, Black Hollow Mining legally could not move extracted material through county land. The entire operation depended on the Reed property. Mason leaned back slowly, not worthless, never worthless. His father hadn't been protecting an old building. He had been blocking an empire. A sound outside interrupted him. Vehicle, one engine only this time. Mason killed the lantern immediately and reached for the shotgun. Ghost woke with a sharp inhale, ears forward despite the pain medication. The engine stopped outside the station. No voices followed. Only one set of footsteps approached. Crunch, crunch, slow, deliberate. Mason moved beside the doorway. The knock came softly. "Mason," a familiar voice called through the wood. "Curtis." Mason closed his eyes briefly. "Of course," Ghost growled low again. "Mason, please, I'm alone." Silence stretched. Finally, Mason opened the door. 3 inches, shotgun hidden behind the frame. Curtis looked terrible. Snow-covered jacket, hollow eyes, face pale from cold and nerves. He held both hands visible. "They followed me halfway up the ridge," Curtis said quickly. "I lost them near Miller Creek." Mason said nothing. Curtis noticed Ghost lying near the heater and flinched when he saw the bandage. "Oh God, you shouldn't be here, I know." Curtis stepped inside slowly after Mason allowed it. The younger brother looked around the ranger station, like he expected ghosts in every corner. Then his eyes landed on the legal documents spread across the table. Understanding crossed his face instantly. "They told me you found something." Mason's jaw tightened. "Who's they?" Curtis swallowed hard. "Nolan Price." The room went still except for the hiss of propane. Curtis rubbed both hands over his face. "He came to the ranch 2 months ago. Said the company needed signatures to finalize expansion permits. He offered money, Mason." "How much?" Curtis looked away. "Enough to save the ranch." Mason already knew the answer before the next words came. "I signed preliminary access papers." Ghost lifted his head sharply. Curtis's voice cracked. "I didn't know about the water rights. I swear to God, I didn't know." Mason stared at his brother for a long time. Outside, wind pressed against the boarded windows. Finally, Curtis whispered the part he had really driven through a blizzard to say, "They know you have the documents now." Mason's fingers tightened slowly around the shotgun stock. Curtis looked at Ghost again, then lowered his voice almost to nothing. "Nolan said if you don't hand everything over." He stopped. Couldn't finish. Mason took one step closer. "What?" Curtis's eyes filled with something close to shame. "He said next time they won't miss the dog." The words settled into the ranger station like cold smoke. Ghost watched Curtis without blinking. Mason stood very still beside the stove, one hand resting lightly against the shotgun. Not threatening, not relaxed either. Curtis rubbed both palms over his jeans. "I didn't know how bad it was, Mason. You signed anyway. I thought it was land access paperwork." Curtis looked up desperately. Amber kept saying we were drowning. Feed prices, bank notices. The ranch was falling apart, and then Nolan shows up talking about investment money and tourism and jobs. And you believed him? Curtis swallowed. Yes. The honesty hurt worse than another lie would have. For a long moment only the wind spoke outside. Then Ghost growled, not loud, focused. Mason turned toward the boarded window immediately. Headlights. Far below the ridge this time. 3 vehicles moving slowly through the trees, searching. Curtis saw them too and went pale. "They followed me." "No," Mason said quietly. "They tracked you." The younger brother closed his eyes. Old anger stirred in Mason's chest, but it felt tired now, heavy. Curtis had spent his whole life trying to hold on to things slipping away. ranches, marriages, peace. Men like Nolan Price knew exactly how to feed on people like that. Ghost rose carefully despite the pain in his shoulder. Mason crouched beside him. "You should stay." The dog ignored him. Again, Mason almost smiled, almost. By sunset, the storm had eased enough for visibility across the lake. That made things worse. Easier to hunt, easier to surround. Mason spread Walter's maps across the ranger station desk. Curtis leaned over beside him while Ghost rested near the heater, ears twitching at every distant sound. "The old Marina Road crosses here," Mason said, tracing the shoreline with one finger. "If Nolan's still moving waste barrels through the North Ridge, he needs access to the frozen lake." Curtis frowned. "So what?" "So men who think they own a valley eventually start talking like they own it." Mason tapped the VHS tape beside the map. He already confessed halfway on this tape. Problem is nobody trusts recordings anymore. Curtis stared at him. "What are you planning?" Mason looked toward the dark windows. "A conversation." The meeting happened the next night at Black Hollow Lake. Nolan chose the location himself after Curtis made the call. Frozen shoreline, midnight, no police. Mason agreed too easily. That made Nolan confident. Good. The lake looked endless under moonlight. Wind pushed snow in silver sheets across the ice. Pines surrounded the shoreline like black teeth. Mason reached the meeting point first. Ghost moved beside him slower now, but steady. Wrapped in a dark thermal vest Ellie had dug out from old canine rescue supplies. The dog's limp showed more in deep snow. Mason hated seeing it. He checked the small recording transmitter taped beneath his jacket collar. Tiny red light blinking once every 5 seconds. Live feed, transmitting back toward the ranger station. Receiver, Curtis was monitoring. Assuming Curtis didn't panic, assuming he stayed, Ghost suddenly froze. Ears forward. Vehicle approaching. Mason moved behind an old boathouse near the shoreline and watched headlights crawl down the Marina Road. One SUV, 2 snowmobiles behind it. Nolan stepped out first, expensive coat, leather gloves. Calm posture. The kind of man who believed danger happened to employees. 3 others spread out quietly near the vehicles. Security, not minors. Mason counted weapons automatically. 2 pistols, 1 rifle case. Ghost gave a low breath beside him. "Easy," Nolan spotted Mason and smiled faintly. "There he is." Mason stepped into view with empty hands. "You brought an army for a conversation." Nolan glanced toward Ghost. "Your dog's tougher than my men expected." Ghost's lips twitched back from his teeth. Nolan noticed. "Relax. If I wanted either of you dead, we wouldn't be talking." Mason said nothing. Silence pressured men like Nolan faster than shouting ever did. Finally, Nolan sighed. "You found the documents, water rights, easements. Walter always was thorough. You killed him, not accusation. Statement." The wind shifted hard across the lake. Nolan's expression barely changed. "Your father got himself killed digging into things he didn't understand. He understood enough to leave evidence." For the first time, Nolan's eyes sharpened slightly. "There are thousands of people in this valley with jobs because of Black Hollow mining. And poisoned water." Nolan spread his hands calmly. "You think the government cares? You think Denver cares about another dying mountain town? Men like your father live in fantasy worlds where truth fixes everything." Ghost growled softly. Nolan glanced down at him. Walter could have walked away rich. Instead, he became a martyr nobody remembers. Mason stepped closer. "You staged the hunting accident." One of Nolan's security men shifted uneasily. Nolan noticed but answered anyway. "Your father pointed a rifle at the wrong people in bad weather." He smiled faintly. "Tragic things happen in the mountains." There, Mason felt the recorder blinking against his chest. "Got you." Then one of the snowmobile men frowned suddenly. "What's that?" He pointed toward Mason's collar. "The red light. Damn." Everything exploded at once. "Grab him." Mason moved before the shout finished. He threw the emergency flare from his pocket hard across the ice. Red fire burst alive, spinning wildly over the frozen lake and flooding the shoreline with violent crimson light. Ghost launched forward instantly, straight at the nearest snowmobile. The machine flipped sideways as the dog hit the driver high in the chest. Man and machine crashed into the snow together. Gunshots cracked. Ice burst near Mason's boots. He dove behind the boathouse wall and ripped the transmitter free, hurling it toward open ice. Another shot. Wood splintered beside his face. Combat breathing returned cold and automatic. Move. Angle. Survive. Ghost barked furiously somewhere beyond the flare smoke. Mason sprinted low along the shoreline while Nolan's men spread out after him. Snow swallowed sound strangely. Gunfire echoed off cliffs like distant mortar fire. Then came a sharp cracking noise beneath everything else. Ice. The flare had drifted toward thinner water near the marina channel. Mason saw Nolan backing away too late. The ice beneath the older man shattered with a sound like breaking bone. Nolan plunged waist-deep into black water instantly. One of his guards ran, another froze. Nolan clawed desperately at the ice edge as freezing water dragged him down. Mason reached him first. For one terrible second he considered leaving him there. Walter, dead. Ghost bleeding, years of poison buried beneath the lake. It would be easy. Ghost limped beside him and barked sharply once. Mason cursed under his breath and dropped flat onto the ice. "Grab my arm." Nolan stared at him in disbelief. "You stupid son of a— grab it!" Nolan did. Mason hauled him forward, inch by inch across the cracking ice, while freezing water soaked both sleeves numb. Then came another voice from the darkness. "Everybody drop the damn guns!" Sheriff Doyle stepped from the trees, holding a revolver aimed directly at Nolan's remaining guards. Behind him stood two county deputies with rifles raised. Nolan coughed violently against the ice. "You crooked old bastard," he spat. Doyle's face looked 20 years older in the moonlight. "My son drank from this lake his whole life," he said quietly. "Died at 26 from liver failure." Silence hit the shoreline hard. The sheriff slowly lifted a small recorder in his free hand. "I got everything." Nolan's face finally changed. Fear, real fear. Then Ghost barked wildly. Mason looked down. The ice beneath them was fracturing outward in long black lines. The whole shoreline groaned. And 30 feet from solid ground, Mason realized both he and Ghost were standing on a sheet of ice beginning to collapse into the freezing dark below. Cracks shot outward beneath their boots like lightning trapped under glass. Sheriff Doyle shouted something from shore, but the wind tore the words apart. Ghost barked once. Sharp. Warning. Mason dropped flat instantly as another section of ice split open beside him with a violent splash of black water. Freezing spray hit his face hard enough to steal breath from his lungs. "Easy," he shouted toward Ghost. The Malinois limped awkwardly across the shifting ice toward him, paws slipping near the widening cracks. Blood from the old gunshot wound stained the snow pink behind him. Mason reached out. "Come on, buddy." Ghost lunged the last few feet. The ice beneath them sagged dangerously. Mason wrapped one arm around the dog's chest and crawled toward shore using elbows and knees, spreading his weight the way mountain rescue teams taught for thin ice crossings. Behind them, Nolan screamed. One of his own men had abandoned him near the broken edge. Sheriff Doyle and a deputy hauled the mining owner toward solid ground with a tow strap while the lake shattered farther under the strain. Mason kept moving 3 feet, 2. The ice cracked again beneath Ghost's hind legs. The dog slipped halfway into freezing water. Mason grabbed the vest handle and hauled, with everything left in him. Pain exploded through his injured knee. Ghost clawed forward desperately. Then strong hands caught Mason's jacket from shore and dragged both man and dog onto frozen gravel just as the entire section of lake ice behind them collapsed inward with a thunderous roar. For several seconds, Mason could only breathe. Snow whipped across the shoreline. Ghost lay against his chest, shivering violently but alive. Sheriff Doyle stood nearby with water dripping from his sleeves and the revolver still hanging loose in one hand. Nolan sat against a snowmobile under deputy supervision, coughing lake water and hatred. The old sheriff looked at Mason. "Your father was right." Mason said nothing. Doyle lowered his eyes toward Ghost. "I should have listened sooner." Federal investigators arrived 3 days later. Then state environmental teams, then reporters. Black Hollow mining unraveled faster than anyone in the valley thought possible. The recordings from Walter's tape combined with Doyle's confession and decades of buried records turned the company inside out. Illegal dumping, bribery, false inspections, deaths buried beneath paperwork. Nolan Price was arrested before the week ended. 2 more executives disappeared into plea deals before spring thaw. The valley changed almost overnight. Roadblocks appeared near the North Ridge. Testing crews drilled through lake ice. Men in hazmat suits moved through Black Hollow like ghosts. And through all of it, Mason stayed mostly at the Carriage house. Home. The word still felt strange some mornings. Snow slowly melted from the roof as winter loosened its grip on the mountains. The broken upstairs window got repaired first, then the generator lines, then the old water system beneath the property. Ghost healed slower. The shoulder wound closed, but the limp remained. Some nights Mason woke to the sound of the dog pacing restlessly across the loft floorboards. Other nights, Ghost woke him before the nightmares fully took hold, pressing against his chest before Afghanistan could return completely. Neither one spoke about it. They just survived it together. By April, the pines around Black Hollow Lake had turned deep green again. Mason stood outside one morning, splitting firewood, when a dusty pickup climbed the access road slowly. Curtis stepped out alone. No Amber, no excuses prepared this time. He looked smaller somehow. The mountains did that to men carrying shame. Ghost watched him carefully from the porch, but did not growl. Curtis stopped near the woodpile. "I heard they're turning the mine property into protected land." Mason nodded once and kept splitting wood. The axe cracked clean through another log. Curtis shoved both hands into his pockets. "I came to say I'm sorry." The words hung there, simple, late, real. Mason leaned the axe against the stump and walked into the Carriage house without answering. When he returned, he carried a small rusted metal box, their father's old ammunition tin. Curtis recognized it immediately. Walter used to keep spare bolts and tractor keys inside it. Mason handed it over. Curtis opened the lid slowly. Inside sat photographs. Their mother laughing beside the lake. Walter teaching 2 small boys to fish from the old dock. A picture of Mason holding a puppy-sized Belgian Malinois, while Bishop stood proudly nearby. Curtis swallowed hard. Mason finally spoke. "Dad kept everything." Curtis nodded once, eyes wet now. Neither brother hugged. Neither needed to. Some wounds closed quietly. By early summer, the Carriage house no longer looked abandoned. The downstairs workshop became a repair space first, then a bunk room, then something more. Veterans started arriving one at a time after Ellie mentioned the place through an old Marine support network. A former Army medic from Wyoming, who couldn't sleep indoors without panic attacks. A Navy corpsman who drank too much after losing both legs below the knee. A young infantryman fresh from overseas who woke screaming 3 nights a week until Ghost climbed onto the cot beside him and stayed there until sunrise. Word spread quietly after that. Not through advertisements, through veterans. The ones who knew how to recognize safe places. Mason rebuilt the old horse stalls into kennel spaces for abandoned service dogs. Ellie handled medical care. Sheriff Doyle, retired now, helped haul lumber and never once complained when Mason worked him too hard. The lake slowly healed too. Trout returned first, then elk tracks near the North Creek. Then families fishing from the shoreline again. One morning, near the end of summer, Mason stood on the upstairs porch holding a cup of black coffee, while fog drifted low across Black Hollow Lake. Below him, Ghost moved slowly through the grass with his permanent limp, checking fences and tree lines like he still believed the whole valley needed guarding. Maybe it did. Inside the carriage house, somebody laughed softly over breakfast. Another veteran slept peacefully for once. The old fireplace glowed warm against the stone walls Walter Reed had fought to protect. Mason looked toward the mountains turning gold beneath sunrise. For years he thought his father left behind only debt, paranoia, and a broken-down building hidden in the wilderness. But standing there in the quiet morning light, he finally understood. Walter had not left him property. He had left him shelter, not for one man, for all the broken ones still trying to find their way home. Ghost looked back toward the porch then, ears lifting slightly. Mason nodded once. The dog settled into the grass beside the lake, and for the first time in a very long while, neither of them felt like they were waiting for the war to come back. Some homes aren't built to keep people out. Some are built so the lost can find their way back. And maybe that's why stories like this stay with us long after they end. Because somewhere out there, a lot of people are still carrying things nobody else can see. If this story meant something to you, take 1 second and comment 1 below. Just a simple 1. So the people reading these comments know they're not alone either. And if you've ever had a dog that stayed beside you through your darkest days, comment your dog's name too. I read more of these than you probably think. Don't forget to subscribe and stick around for the next story. There are still more forgotten places, more loyal dogs, and more people trying to find their way back home. I'll see you in the next one.